I've worked with a lot of manufacturers, so I've had the opportunity to learn a lot myself from a varied number of people over the years. And I'm just going to offer you that feedback now, the information that I have, so that you'll hopefully be able to make your own decisions with use of your AED and decisions on what your activation altitudes are and the types of skydiving you use your AEDs with. So if you leave this conversation continuing to talk about it and have further questions and discuss it amongst yourselves in the drop zone, then this will be a successful use of all of our time. And that's my goal this morning, just to share some information. And I believe I have the opportunity to share my screen. Is that possible as well?
Yes, you should be able to share.
Okay, let's figure out, where do I do that?
It is down at the bottom on the right-hand side. I think it says activities.
Activities.
So I think it's got a little
activities, there it is, yes.
Yeah. Is it in there?
Breakout rooms, polls, Q&A, recording, whiteboarding.
Or maybe it's down the bottom here. Yeah, so actually it's down the bottom there, Tom. You see there's a little arrow in the square, and if you click on that, it says present now, and I think that will let you in.
Okay, yep. Yes, okay. All right, I think I just shared my screen.
There we go.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Great. So I want to start off with a couple of videos, and they're AED fire videos. Of course, an exciting way to start your Saturday morning. Nothing I'm going to show you today, any minutes hurt, killed. I do that especially on a Zoom meeting. All these videos have successful outcomes, but they all have great learning opportunities as well. So we're going to run this first one. So what just happened there? We had an AFF instructor who chased a student quite low and ended up with an AED fire as a result of it. And I don't know how many of you on board here are AFF instructors, but one of the things that we learn as part of the AFF program is that we have minimum altitudes as instructors, that we're not trained to chase the students down to AED firing altitude. And as a result of this instructor's decision to chase them down there, they ended up throwing out their main pilot chute at the same time they activated. And that could have potentially been an entanglement between the main and reserve canopies, and worst case scenario could have been an incident and or a fatality. That's the instructor themselves. The student as well is also approaching their own AED activation altitude, and the instructor deploys the main pilot chute or main parachute of the student as well, which thankfully did not result in an AED fire, but also could have had the same scenario happen to the student. So when I show this video, I show it as the worst case scenario of what happens when we don't understand how our AEDs work. And if you think about how many AFF jumps happen all around the world successfully, and then how many of them go unsuccessful around the world, there's still quite a few AFF jumps year in and year after year where instructors lose students. It's an inevitability of the process. Eventually an AFF instructor is going to lose a student. And while most of us with AFF ratings would say to ourselves, that could never happen to me, the reality is it does. And it does. what happens to all of the procedures and all of the training that we have in our process? It goes out the window. The idea of chasing a student down to under 2,000 feet to deploy a main parachute. There's no AFF program in the world that advocates that type of performance and that type of behavior, to be dumping out an AFF student under 2,000 feet, especially when both student and instructor have armed and active AEDs on board. So it's just a lack of understanding of how our performance within the confines of using an AED can affect the outcome of our skydives. And that's really what this conversation is simply about. It's to get you thinking about the fact that this little onboard computer behind your back that most of you will never, ever have an opportunity to interact with, thankfully, every time we jump with it, it has the potential to interact with us in negative ways that we're not prepared for if we're not fully prepared to understand how that unit works within our skydiving. And that's what this PowerPoint presentation and these videos I'm going to share with you are all about. I'm going to start my presentation. So AEDs in modern skydiving scenarios, understanding your AED. This is the presentation that I travel and I present with around the world. Hopefully you guys will take something away from it. The reason why I think AEDs are so important and understanding them ultimately is so important is that back in the 1990s, when they were first introduced into the skydiving community, they were sold with the concept of set it and forget it. The idea that we would just turn it on at the beginning of the day and we wouldn't have to think about it at all throughout the course of the day. And at the time, the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, that was a relatively accurate assessment, because at the time we really only had one kind of skydiving. We had belly to earth free fall, and that meant we were all falling at about the same fall rate, 120 miles an hour. So we could turn our AED on and forget that it was a part of our system for the day as we went about our skydiving. But we really can't do that today anymore. And for those of you that have been around the sport for decades, you'll have this understanding and this visibility of the fact that the types of disciplines that we've developed over the years have changed our fall rate speeds. We've got wingsuiting and free flying and angle flying and all these great new ways to fly our bodies, but they're also changing our deployments, our free fall speeds as we fall through the sky. And that's having a dramatic effect on our AEDs that we're using in our systems today. And that's really why we can't use the analogy set it, forget it anymore. It's just not practical in today's modern skydiving environment. Here's another video. And again, most of these videos I pulled off the internet. They're all there for you to find yourself. All right, if those two skydivers did not have AEDs on their sport parachute systems, this video would be a double fatality. Instead, thankfully, both of them survived, and they ended up, both of them being deployed out of this two-way formation with their reserve parachutes. The number one cause of AED activations in all of skydiving is altitude loss, loss of altitude awareness. We simply don't know how high we are. We become task focused and task fixated on the skydive that we are performing. In this case, it's as simple as a two-way skydive with two relatively new skydivers. But imagine as your skydives get more complex, you turn a two-way into a four-way into an eight-way belly dive into a 10-way angle tracking dive, and so on. The more complex we get our skydives, and the more complex our skydives become, the more likely we have the possibility of loss of altitude awareness. So if you're taking notes, or mental notes, or just things you want to take away from this, that loss of altitude awareness is the #1 cause of AD activations. And that as our skydives become more complex and more people involved in them, there's a higher probability of losing altitude awareness. Now, there's another problem with loss of altitude awareness, and that is actually dependency on mechanical devices other than our AED, specifically our audibles in our helmets. Now, I don't know in this video if they had audibles or not. I do know personally of about three skydivers that I've worked with over the years that have had AED fires, which is a loss of altitude awareness because the batteries died in their audible altimeters. They kept waiting for that alarm to go off in their ear, and they literally were going to wait the rest of their lives for that alarm to go off. So if you are a skydiver who relies on audible altimeters, and I'm an advocate for them, their audible altimeters are another layer of defense in protecting us in terms of altitude awareness loss, but we can become reliant on them. So if you are using an audible altimeter, you must know that that actually creates a possibility of loss of altitude awareness if the batteries are to fail or the unit's not turned on when you're jumping it. So just to be aware that reliance on other mechanical devices we work with can result in loss of altitude awareness and these types of AED activations. So what is an AED? An automatic activation device, whether it's a Cypress 2, a Vigil, a Mars. I think those are the only three common ones out there today. Your AEDs are basically electronic to mechanical devices. They have an electronic component, a small little onboard computer. In that sense, it makes them a lot like an iPhone. They're just little computers that we carry around with us. And then they have mechanical devices as well, cutter systems, essentially guillotines for our reserve closing loops. And those two systems, the electronic and the mechanical devices, they work together, and they are simply there as a last ditch effort to put a reserve over our head if we fail to put a parachute over our head ourselves. That's why we buy them, why we spend all that money on them, and why we turn them on every day before we go skydiving. We don't ever expect to need it or use it, but it's there in the unlikely event that we do. And a couple of characteristics of your AED, because it's just an electronic and mechanical device, unlike you and I, it doesn't get excited. Unlike you and I, it doesn't get scared. There's no human component of emotion with your AED. It's simply a cold, unfeeling calculator, and all it does is math. It does a lot of math. 4 times a second, it measures your barometric pressure changes, and it uses that change to determine your airspeed and altitude as far as your fall rate and how high or how low you are during your skydive. That's all it does. It does math over and over and over again. And if certain criteria are met based on the math that it does, if it believes that you are falling at a speed in excess of approximately 78 miles per hour, and forgive me, I don't know what that translates to kilometers, but it's a little bit faster. Maybe it's 120, 130 kilometers an hour, and you're falling past 750 feet or whatever its predetermined altitude is, it will initiate that guillotine cutter. That's all it does. It's the only decision it wants to make is, do I push that cutter through the cylinder? Even if there's no loop, it's still going to push the cutter through the cylinder. That's all this little robot, all this little mechanical electronic device cares about: doing math and deciding one of two things. Do I push the cutter through the cylinder, or do I leave the cutter where it is? And that's it. That's all this unit is designed to do. So let me tell you a scary story. Story time with Tom, Saturday morning, 9 a.m. A friend of mine came back from recurrency in the winter cold up in Boston, Massachusetts, and when it came time to deploy his main parachute, he had on thick gloves and he wasn't very current. He had a difficult time finding his hacky, his pilot chute. He waved off, he reached back for his hacky, he couldn't find it. Couldn't find his hacky, so logically what was his next step was to try to find his reserve handle. He had a total malfunction, the container was closed, he was plummeting towards the earth to his death, truthfully. So he reached for his reserve and he couldn't find his reserve either. So this was at about 2,000 feet. This all happened 2,000 feet through 1,500 feet. My friend, I would like to tell you, spent the rest of his life trying to find that handle and fight that handle and pull that handle and save his own life. But that's not what actually happened. Rather than attempt to find that reserve handle for the rest of his life, what my friend did was he put himself in a nice neutral boxman position, and he waited, and he waited, and he waited. And at 750 feet, his Cypress fired, it deployed his reserve parachute and it saved his life. So the story has a happy ending. My friend survived. However, the tragedy of that story is that my friend relied on a mechanical device, an electronic device to save his life rather than attempting to save his own life and putting a parachute over his head. So that's the foundation of this AAD presentation is this. An AAD is never meant to replace your activation of your reserve parachute manually. We are supposed to fight for the rest of our lives to find that reserve handle. And the reason for that is that there's a number of reasons why an AED won't work correctly. And it's possible that the AED could have failed to fire. Perhaps he forgot to turn it on before the day started as part of his currency. Maybe he was so uncurrent, he forgot to turn the AED on. And if the AED wasn't on and he waited for it to fire, he would have died. Perhaps the rigger didn't put the loop through the cutter. We're supposed to do that as riggers, of course, but I can think of at least 2 or 3 different examples over the last 20 years where riggers have failed to put loops through the cutter unit. Again, it would have failed. Or he might have simply been falling really, really fast, 160, 170 miles an hour, and there might not have been enough time and altitude for the reserve pilot chute to completely deploy the reserve parachute system through an AAD fire, whereas had he continued to fight himself and found the handle at 1,200 feet or 1,100 feet, that could have meant the difference between life or death. So there's a lot of different reasons why it is our responsibility to deploy our reserve parachute. We never, ever, ever rely on our AEDs to save our lives. We are always supposed to deploy our reserve parachute. Now, a follow-up to that story from about 15, 16 years ago, maybe close to 20 now, so much time has gone by. The same thing happened a year ago to another friend of mine up there. Couldn't find his handles and sat in, got nice and comfortable in a reserve, in a neutral box man position and waited for his AED to fire. And again, thankfully it did. But to me, that's a tragedy of a story because to me, it represents 2 people that I know in my life that have no understanding or idea of how an AED is supposed to work within our system and what our responsibilities are as skydivers. So my favorite question in this presentation is, your AAD has 2 jobs, and everyone's aware of one of them, but we're always not so aware of what the second one is. So an AAD, because it has 2 jobs, to me is just like a coffee pot. A primary job of your coffee pot is to make coffee, right? That's why we buy it. We love coffee, so we go to the store and we buy a coffee pot. We're all aware of that. So we all think about our AEDs in the same manner. We buy an AED not because we love coffee. We buy an AED because we expect it's going to activate and save our life if we don't open up a parachute over our head. That's the understanding of the unit. But your AED has a second equally as critical job, just like your coffee pot does. And the second job is one that we're not very familiar with. Can anybody contribute here? Let me know, what's the second job of the coffee pot? Are you guys, I'm sorry, are you guys able to speak? All I see is my...
They should be able to mute themselves if they want, unmute themselves if they want to talk, I think.
Okay. All right, well, don't everybody jump in all at once.
To keep the coffee hot.
Keep the coffee hot, I love it. That is a very important job because we love hot coffee. However, the coffee pot's second job, which is just as important as making you coffee, it might even be more important, is don't burn the house down when it's not making coffee. The coffee pot shuts off after it's done making its coffee, right? Otherwise, it could burn the house down. So your AED has a second job, which is equally as important. And that second job is not to activate when we do not want it to activate. We only want the AED to activate when it's going to save our life. If we're unable to do so for any reason, medically, dislocated arms, can't find our handles, the AED is designed to activate or make coffee. That's what it's intended for. It's why we use it. What it's not intended to do, its second job, is to not burn the house down, not to activate when we don't want it to activate. And more today, as we have more and more skydiving disciplines being created, more and more radical canopy designs, we're seeing AEDs activating in scenarios they were not intended to. So this next video I'm going to show you, also available on YouTube. Beautiful, there in Hawaii. It's another example. It's another example of an AED. This example, however, this is job number 2. This is burning the house down. This is what it looks like when the house burns down. Beautiful view there over Oahu. And I'm going to pause here for 1 second. If anyone here knows, I know in New Zealand, we're New Zealand Aerosports advocates and customers, and I love New Zealand Aerosports as well. In the US, PD's the primary canopy manufacturer, right? So this is PD's Valkyrie. It's an important little symbol here because there's actually going to be a New Zealand Aerosports homework assignment as well. But this is the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie is not a Petra, it's not a Peregrine, it's not the highest performance class of parachute, but it's pretty close. Can anyone tell me what the Nzpf, or the New Zealand Aerosports version of the Valkyrie is? That's just below top tier class canopy. What's just below a Petra?
Is it the Leia?
Yes, the Leia. So I've created, in my mind, a new term for canopies. I call them hyperclass canopies. They're not pro, they're not Petra, they're not Peregrine, but they're like a hyperclass canopy. It's a Valkyrie and it's a Leia. It's an almost professional pro swooper canopy. That should be important. Any of you that are jumping these hyperclass parachutes, they're not the pro ones, they're not the Petras and the Peregrines, but they're just short of that. They have the ability to do something on a consistent basis that no other parachute before that ever was able to do, and that is exceed the speeds of the AED firing altitude, excuse me, exceed the speeds of the AED firing speeds at that altitude. And I'm going to pause for effect here. On a consistent basis. There have been AED fires on JVXs, FXs, on velocities, on comp velocities, on chaoses, but in order for you to have an AED fire on those slightly lower version of high class cross brace canopies, you had to be perfect. Perfect altitude, perfect turn, perfect release. Everything had to be perfect for you to set off the conditions for that AED to fire. With these hyperclass canopies, Leias and Valkyries, you don't have to be perfect. There's a high likelihood that these parachutes under high wing loadings can set off AEDs, whether it's Cypresses or Vigils or Mars, just through your normal 270 hook turns, your normal approaches. Now this is a little bit more than a 270, but it does illustrate that point exactly that I'm trying to make here. Back in 2005, we lost a skydiver named Adrian Nicholas. Adrian was a high performance canopy pilot back in the early 2000s, and he was the first solo skydiver, the first sport jumper to die from an AED activation during a swoop. Prior to that time, it was inconceivable that a parachute could go over 78 miles per hour on its descent to the ground. But then parachute manufacturers, all of them, PD, Icarus, New Zealand Aerosports, Precision, all the canopy manufacturers started building better, higher performance parachutes, and those speeds got closer and closer to 78 miles per hour on descent, that as pilots learned to fly them better and more efficiently, eventually, and unfortunately, Adrian was the first one to exceed that speed limit. So I give you his name because I don't want it to be lost to history, because it's important that we remember these things. And from my perspective, what happened to Adrian was an absolute accident. Up until that point, it had never happened before. It was not thought possible that a skydiver could go fast enough to activate an AED under a parachute. Now, once this tragedy happened to Adrian and he died as a result of it, it never should have happened again, in my opinion. Once we realized that there was a problem with parachutes going faster than the AED speeds as they pass through their altitudes, that we knew it was possible that we could prevent it from happening through equipment and user improvements. Sadly, however, we've lost dozens of skydivers over the years and had dozens and dozens more dramatic injuries, broken legs, broken backs due to these AED activations. And if you look back at the site picture here of this swoop gone wrong in Hawaii, the intended target was to pass through the concrete to end up into the main landing area, to swoop down this lane. And if that happened over the concrete a little bit higher, the skydiver absolutely could have and would have been injured and possibly killed in that environment. So this could have potentially been a fatality. And I absolutely appreciate this skydiver's honesty. He goes on to say, he was knowingly jumping an expert Cypress 2. He forgot that he had turned it on, and he was intending to swap it out for the new speed Cypress. So smart, intelligent skydiver. He knew there was a speed Cypress. He knew that his parachute could exceed those limits. And he was planning to swap his expert Cypress out for a speed Cypress. Made a whole bunch of good decisions to protect himself because he understood how his AED worked. But then he fell victim to a human flaw. He simply forgot about it. And that one flaw, that one decision, or that one lapse of judgment absolutely could have killed him. And thankfully it didn't. Thankfully he's still here. But imagine that, knowing that you're jumping a parachute that can exceed the speeds, you know you need to put the new unit in and you're going to do it, and then you simply forget to do it. Or sorry, in this case, forget to turn off the unit if you're going to jump that canopy, knowing that there's a potential for that fire to happen. And I'm not suggesting turning off your AEDs if you're swooping high performance parachutes. What I'm suggesting is the other option is, if he knows that an expert Cypress is turned on, to not make a large, big, fast turn, knowing that that potential could happen. If he kept his turn to 90 degrees, that probably wouldn't have happened. So understanding his unit and then forgetting to turn it off ultimately is what led to that scenario. So those are our two jobs of our AEDs. Activate when we want them to, and then not to activate when we don't want them to. Of the three parameters that your AEDs operate off of, the one we're all familiar with is activation. That's the cutting. That's the cutter through the cylinder. But there's two other parameters that you need to be aware of as well if you're truly going to understand your AEDs, and those are the arming altitudes and the disarming altitudes. The arming altitude is the altitude that the unit goes active, meaning that even though it's turned on the ground, that decision to push the cutter through the cylinder will not be made unless the unit has climbed off of the ground to a certain altitude. And that altitude varies by system, which I'm going to review with you quickly. And then there's also a disarming altitude, and that's the critical one today of swoopers. Has the unit disarmed? A speed Cypress will disarm the unit at a much higher altitude than a non-speed Cypress. That prevents this accidental two-out situation during a swoop happening. But all of the units have disarming altitudes. So knowing what altitude the system won't activate, even if it meets the criteria, is also important to understand. They're always changing. Every time I put these slides together, the manufacturers of the AEDs come out with new parameters. So I ask all of you, don't take these as fact. Go back and look at your own operating manual for your Vigils and your Cypresses and your Mars, just to confirm my numbers are right, because every time I do this presentation, it seems like they've changed the numbers. But for general purposes, the Vigil 2 Plus and the Cuatro will arm at 1,000 feet, meaning if I roll out of an aircraft at 800 feet, no matter how fast I go, there's not going to be an activation. The older Vigil and Vigil 2 have a 150-foot 150-foot arming altitude. And then all of them disarm at 150 feet. So once you've hit 150 feet or lower, you can go as fast as you want. No matter what criteria are met, speed and altitude, it won't activate the cutter system. Cypress 2 arms 1,500 feet, so that's one difference. If you're jumping a Cypress 2, it arms 1,500 feet higher, and it disarms about 20 feet lower at 130 feet. You'll notice there's no original Cypress in this anymore because the original Cypresses have all timed out. So if any of you have an original Cypress, remove them from your systems because they're no longer within their maintenance windows and no longer active. Only be using Cypress 2s if you're jumping a Cypress. The newest one, MM2, and I admit I'm not very familiar with them. In their pro mode, they arm at 130 feet and they disarm at 330 feet. And all of them have a firing altitude of approximately 750 feet, 850 feet, and or 1,000 feet and 1,100 feet, whether you're on your belly or your back, which is the next thing we're going to get to. But before we get there, we're just going to review that there's a number of different AED types out today. You've got a pro or sport version, a tandem version, a student version, a swoop version, a wingsuit version, and even now a multi-mode version. So whereas 20 plus years ago, if you bought a Cypress, you either bought an expert Cypress, a student Cypress, or a tandem Cypress. Those were your options. Now we have at least 6 different options available. So we've doubled our options, which has now doubled the complexity of our decision-making process. And for those of you out there that do tandem jumps, your tandem systems also have different arming and activation and disarming altitudes. The tandem units typically don't arm until above 2,000 feet, or in Cypress 2's case, 3,000 feet or 2,800. And they have an approximate 2,000 foot activation altitude across the board. One second. So the problem with our skydiving today, if you can call it that, and why our skydiving is free fall speeds have created issues for our AEDs, our mechanical devices, is that now the units have to attempt to determine what type of skydiving we're doing, as well as deciding whether or not it's simply going to push a cutter through a cylinder if certain criteria are met. Now we have wingsuits that have fall rates that are so slow, they can actually fly slower than the descent speeds necessary for an AED to fire. And there have been incidents, and at least one fatality that I'm aware of, where a wingsuiter jumping a pro or expert version of their AED flew right through 750 feet without an activation because they never exceeded the vertical fall rate speed to initiate the activation. So that's a lack of understanding of how our skydiving is affecting the unit. The AED unit doesn't care what kind of skydiving you're doing. It just cares, are you falling faster or slower than a predetermined speed to determine whether an activation is necessary. And if you put on a wingsuit and you're jumping in expert mode, Cypress or Vigil, and you have one of those big suits, you can fly right through your AED activation altitude window without an AED activation because of the fall rate speed being so slow. You might be going 130 miles an hour across the sky, but your horizontal descent rate might be 30 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour, not fast enough to initiate an activation. And like I said, that has killed at least one person over the years. Another issue is free flying, or as I like to say, falling in the fast lane. When we are belly to earth, we fall at approximately 120 miles an hour. When we fall head down or feet up, we fall approximately 180 miles an hour. Now, for those of you that are good with math and closing speeds, at 120 miles an hour, at 750 feet, we are approximately 4 seconds from the ground. When we are vertical on our head or on our feet at 180 miles an hour, we're approximately 2.5 seconds from the ground, maybe 3. So our distance, our closing gap becomes much smaller when we're going much faster. And I hope I explained that correctly. If you think about the AED activation altitudes, historically when they were set in 1996, 750 feet at 120 miles an hour gave a certain amount of time and altitude for an activation to occur. But when we changed the orientation of our skydiving, which increases our fall rate speed, we're reducing the probability that we have enough time and altitude for that reserve activation to effectively complete and finish with the reserve parachute over our head. And there have been multiple people that have unfortunately died, hit the ground as the reserve parachute was finishing its inflation process, because they were falling at 150, 160, 170 miles an hour. They were falling so fast that there simply wasn't enough time and altitude within that margin to be able to finish their reserve deployment sequence. So if you are, like me, a heavier skydiver, my neutral body position in a boxman in a tight suit is about 135 miles an hour. So I'm falling about 10% faster than the intended activation speeds for my AEDs. Therefore, I've taken away about 10% of my operational window for my reserve to finish its deployment sequence. Absolutely a factor to consider. So we have slow falling wingsuits and high flying free flyers, and there's everything in between. Angle flying, there's tight jumpsuits, there's sit flying, there's all kinds of different artistic skydiving that we do up there, flips and spins and pirouettes. All of those change our fall rates. Back flying, knee flying, all these different ways we can skydive. Understand what the type of skydiving you're doing is, and ultimately understand what effect it has on your free fall speed in relationship to 120 miles an hour. Every one of us should know approximately what our free fall speed is in the type of skydiving we're doing, and use that to judge against the 750-foot, 120-mile-an-hour window. Is that enough altitude and time for us to successfully complete our reserve deployment? And again, the bottom one here, even now canopies, we covered that already. Canopies can dramatically exceed 78 miles per hour in that window. Okay, another video. Here's a wingsuiter who can't find their reserve handle. So that noise you just heard was him cutting away. His handles, there were some suits about 10 years ago that could potentially suck the handles up into the suit. He spent that time on his back trying to find his cutaway handle, and he gets the cutaway handle, and you can clearly see he's relatively low to the ground, easily under 1,000 feet, and now he can't find his reserve handle. So he's on a wingsuit. We've already covered the fact that wingsuits can fall slow enough not to have an AED activation. He can't find his reserve handle, but he's aware enough to realize that he still has an option left, and that's to increase his fall rate speed above 78 miles per hour. So he actually takes himself into a head down orientation like a lawn dart and starts, speeding up towards the ground in hopes that his speed will be fast enough to initiate a reserve activation. And he was able to do so. So I like this video for that reason, that it shows that someone absolutely understood how their AED worked. He didn't understand how his wingsuit worked very well. If both of his handles got sucked up into his suit and he couldn't access them very easily, that's a bigger problem. Obviously, that's what led to the issue, the first problem. But having found himself in the worst case scenario, he's low to the ground, he's in a big wingsuit that's going to slow his fall rate down, and he can't activate his reserve handle. He makes a deliberate decision to increase his fall rate speed in an attempt to exceed the 78 miles per hour of the AED unit, and initiates an AED fire that ultimately saves his life. So in that capacity, it's a pretty good story to tell. So what about belly flying or back flying when we are really low to the ground? Our worst case scenario, we've lost consciousness and we're upside down on our back, or maybe we're a newer skydiver and we're having difficulty righting ourselves back over onto our belly and we're just falling on our back towards the earth. Well, if we're on our back and we're falling towards the earth and we roll over onto our belly, something happens to the AEDs. And it doesn't really matter what altitude it happens at. It happens at all altitudes. If you're on your back, you roll over onto your belly, the AED for about a split second thinks that you've levitated. It thinks that you've actually gone back up in the air about 250 feet. And the reason for that is that the sensor that reads the pressure is on the back of your neck. And when we're belly to earth, that little sensor is in a burble, and our burble is a low pressure zone. But when we roll over onto our back, that pressure sensor is now in a high pressure zone. So if it determines your altitude using this high pressure zone, and you immediately roll back over onto your belly and your pressure dramatically decreases, the first calculations that your AED is going to do is calculate a rise in altitude. You've levitated back up 250 feet. And it will then immediately, what they call smooth it over and bring it back down to where it was. All of these AED manufacturers have calculations and algorithms upon algorithms to help smooth over these little inconsistencies in our fall rates and our burbles and our pressure altitudes. But remember, it's just a calculator and it's just a mechanical device. It's not a living, thinking entity. So it is capable of misjudging, even if for a split second, a quarter of a second, your altitude difference and levitate back up 250 feet. So this is what it looks like. I'm going to fast forward this. I know we're running short on time here. The jumper's having a difficult time finding his hacky. He can't, it's either a hard pull or he can't get to it. And you're going to see in these last few moments that he ends up rolling over onto his back. So he's on his back. The pressure is increased. And he magically then rolls back over again and magically levitates. That smoothing over happens. And the AED then makes that decision to activate the reserve. At absolutely the last moment. So he ends up surviving this, no injuries, a little bit of a hard landing. I'll play that through. And that's how quick it happens. So for me, if nothing else, this video is an argument to raise your AED activation altitude, regardless of whether it's a Cypress or a Vigil, 250 feet upwards. So rather than 750 feet, 1,000 feet. Those extra feet make a difference in this bottom end versus not having that last 50, 100 feet to be able to finish that deployment sequence. Now this video I'm about to show you illustrates the most important part of being a skydiver. If you want to skydive more than once, you have to put a parachute over your head. The number one priority you have on every skydive is to open up your parachute. That's it. Everything else is secondary. If you don't open a parachute, you cannot make another skydive. What you're going to see here is an example of task focused in the wrong area. The skydiver, his chest strap came disconnected during his free fall. Now, given the option of reattaching your chest strap or opening your main parachute, which one has a higher survival rate? Opening your parachute or putting on your chest strap? This skydiver is so focused on his chest strap that he has an AED fire. He's on his back. Now remember, he's falling to his death right now because he's not put a parachute over his head. He's trying to get his chest strap in, Loss of altitude awareness, loss of focus. Trying to put his chest strap in. If it wasn't for his AED, he would have crashed through the hangars underneath him. He would have spent the rest of his life trying to put his chest strap together. And even now, he's just had an AAD fire. He's under 1,000 feet. He's less than 500 feet at this point. He's going to land off in an industrial complex. And instead of unstowing his toggles and finding a safe place to land, what is he still doing? He's still focused on his chest strap. Wait for it. He's on the ground and he's still trying to put his chest strap back together. That's the humanity of what we do, the human nature. Obviously, he was scared, he was nervous, he was fixated on that chest strap. And it's important to highlight all these people in these videos, all these incidents. They're all good people, all smart people, all active, competent skydivers. They just didn't understand how their AEDs worked in relationship to the skydiving they were doing. And that could be, ultimately could be any one of us at any point in time if we're not prepared for it. So I know we're getting tight on time. Cut me off at any time. I know we're at 45 minutes. I should be done in less than 5. Just want to show an example here of burning down the house. That AD activation resulting in a 2-out scenario. This is a test jumper. It's a New Zealand Aerosports test jumper, and I've asked for their permission and received their permission to share this video. They actually posted it on their Facebook page. I think it's a great learning opportunity because, let me just run it through first, then we'll talk about it. Okay, so why this video is so powerful for me is that it's a test jumper for a manufacturer, and if an AED fire from a swoop can happen on a test jump with a manufacturer with presumably some of the most skilled and talented canopy pilots in the world acting as test jumpers, then that means it could happen to any one of us. If we're not prepared, if we don't understand the relationship between our AED and the canopies that we're flying. So remember Adrian Nicholas, it happened in 2015. The truth, the reality is this very well could have been another fatality as a result of the same situation that happened with Adrian now 16 years ago. And that's the greatest tragedy in this part of our AED discussion, is simply the fact that we know that this is possible. We know that it's capable of happening. So if any of you are even slightly concerned or convinced that your canopy speeds could reach 78 miles per hour or higher and end up with a AED activation during your swoop, stop swooping with that AED on behind you. And I'm not saying turn off your AED. I'm saying stop swooping it at high speeds and big turns until you have figured out what your speeds are, if they are or not near or above that activation altitude. And if they are getting close to it, get a speed Cypress or a extreme mode Vigil to prevent this from happening if that's what the type of skydiving you're doing. Okay, I know we're tight on time here, so I'm going to skip component compatibility other than to simply say there's so many different combinations of gear out there, main canopies, reserve parachutes, harness containers, and AEDs, that make sure your rigger is comfortable with the compatibility and the fit of each of those components. Because if you put too big of a reserve and too big of a main in your container and have an AED fire, it could potentially slow down the deployment process of the reserve pilot chute and thus the reserve parachute. So just making sure that you have the right combination of compatible components is critical in ensuring that if you do have a reserve activation with an AD fire, the reserve has the highest probability of successful outcome. Okay, this is your reserve deployment sequence. It starts pilot chute, bridle, bag, lines, canopy. That component system has to work in that sequence. So this goes back to making sure we have the right compatible components to make sure that the reserve deployment sequence happens in that staged order in a timely manner. We covered free fall speeds exceeding 120 miles an hour already. We covered the burble effect on your back versus on your belly. Here's a burble effect of a wingsuit. This is a main parachute coming off your back with a wingsuit burble. Now imagine that same burble effect occurring on a reserve parachute. So if you have a low AD activation reserve parachute, and this happens, it has the potential to foul your reserve and or to delay the reserve opening in that very critical time frame, low to the ground. So just being aware of that. If you're flying if you're flying wingsuits, that perhaps having a slightly higher AD activation altitude might give you a better opportunity for your reserve to deploy cleanly if it ever ends up finding itself in a burble on your wingsuit. So I've raised my deployment altitude by 500 feet in my ADs that I use for my sport jumping because I don't deploy parachutes below 3,000 feet anymore. So my 1,250 foot is my AD activation altitude because I want the extra altitude for my increase in speed, my more time to land off if I need to, but ultimately to ensure that I have enough time for my reserve to complete its deployment sequence process well above the ground, rather than right as I'm reaching the ground. There's a saying in aviation, the most useless thing in all of aviation is the runway behind the pilot and the altitude above the airplane. Same thing for skydivers. The most useless thing for us when we're close to the ground is all that altitude above us that our parachutes could be deploying in. So I'm not suggesting that anyone increase their activation altitudes for their ADs. I'm simply suggesting that you consider increasing your activation altitudes for your ADs. Talk to each other about it. Talk to your chief safety officers about it. Talk to your manufacturers and your drop zone owners. For some of you, that might be the right answer. For others, it might not be. It's an individual choice for each of us. Okay, if we land, and am I doing okay for time? I don't want to take up anybody else's time. Are we still good?
Now you can hear me. I can give you just 1 or 2 more minutes. We've got Jules starting in 5. So if you can wrap it up in a couple of minutes, that would be amazing.
Perfect. I'll end with this. We'll skip landing offsets. Make sure that your ADs, if you're landing off, they're set to the altitude you're landing at, not taking off at. But this is what I want to end with. All these 2-out videos that you've seen, all the 2-out scenarios of AD fires, they all have one thing in common. Sport parachutists deployed their pilot chutes well below their decision altitude. If you have 2,000 skydives and you've thrown your pilot chute out 2,000 times under normal circumstances, when you lose altitude awareness and find yourself at 1,300 feet and you're about to enter into your AD activation altitude and you're below your decision altitude, you should deploy your reserve. Go straight for your reserve. What you will do and what I will do and what all skydivers will do, unless we're thinking about it and prepare for it ahead of time, is you'll reach back like you've done 2,000 other times and throw your pilot chute out no matter what altitude you're at. So understanding that there will come an altitude where you are not going to throw your pilot chute out and go straight to your reserve. And what is that altitude? And stick to that and remind yourself of that, because every 2 out is a potential double entanglement that results in a fatality. We get away with it, and we're lucky because the parachutes are designed really well, but just remember that there is a decision altitude, and once you're below your decision altitude, if you find yourself still in free fall, straight to your reserve. But if you throw a pilot chute out at 1,200 feet or 1,300 feet from your main, you're going to end up with a 2 out, and that is a much more dangerous situation than going straight to your reserve as you're supposed to. So that's my wrap. I hope that was helpful for everybody. Let me go back to this. I think we're here. I will stop presenting. Hopefully that was of use.
Well,
Read your manuals.
I for one learned a huge amount by way of refresher and new information. Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. Does anybody have a question for Tom? We need to keep it quick, but if anybody does have a question. But I think it was a very comprehensive presentation.
Thank
so maybe
you. Hi, Jules. Miss you.
Tom.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tom. So for everybody else who's continuing on, Jules McConnell is with us next. Jules is attending this presentation and is giving the next one. I'm going to close down this meeting and start a new one so that we can record all of these presentations as standalone items. So see you all in the next presentation. Thank you again, Tom. We really appreciate it.
Bye, guys. Cheers. Hope to see you next year.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tom.